It's thinking about it. I think
we're
live. Calling Chris Anderson in London.
London answering. Hello.
Oh, awesome.
Rick Beyer, Chicago.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And we want to welcome everybody to History Happy Hour on the Stephen Ambrose Facebook and YouTube pages. And we encourage you to, like Ann just did, Deanne Jones, to give us a comment and let us know that you're here and that you're watching. And so we would appreciate that.
Yes, we would.
And we're going to wait just a moment or two so that people have a chance to join us. And remind you that we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. What time is it in London, Chris?
It is 9 o'clock in London.
Okay, and I think it's 2 p.m. where our guest today, who's not on with us quite yet, is coming from. So we are spanning the globe with History Happy.
International.
It's very exciting. But you know, Chris, the show doesn't really start until what happens? What has to happen for the show to start?
The intro.
We have to do the intro. So I think we're up to 40 plus viewers. I think it's intro time. Here we go. Okay, so the bar is open.
Open.
Here for History Happy Hour. And we just, we thought we would, before we go to our guest today, who I'm sure is looking on all this with quite a jaundiced eye, we thought we would try to show you a little bit of behind the scenes at History Happy Hour. So I'm sure, Chris, that our audience believes that we have amazing technical facilities in London and Chicago, and in that they are sadly mistaken. But we're going to show you. So we're going to each bring on for each of us our second camera because we are up with it today.
We think.
We are sort of up with it. This is Chris's second camera. There he is. That is Chris Anderson in his amazing studio there in London with the painted books in the background.
That's right. Yep. I rented those.
I know. Excellent. And Maddie, you can pan over and let us see his computer there. Chris's signal's been freezing a little bit. So I'll also show you, we have here our Chicago studio. Greetings. Okay. So you can see where it's all happening. And again, I've shoved every book I can in the background so that I look like I'm an erudite human being.
Well, I just want to point out, though, excuse my Scotsman lighting cigarette. That's very important.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
My cameraman
right behind you. It's pretty exciting.
My mascot, fat bastard.
Okay. It's all happening there. Oh, well, I could bring you. Sometimes you see him, and sometimes you don't. But I do have Han Solo.
Stop grabbing his ass. Oh, there you go.
Han Solo as a stormtrooper.
Ooh.
So pretty exciting. All right, I think that's enough of behind the scenes. I'm surprised that there's any audience still left. So let's get rid of those shots. Thank you very much, Madeline. And Chris, do you have a drink today?
I do. Just to show that I'm contributing to the delinquency of a minor. This is called a Malhorta muddle. My daughter is spending her lockdown learning how to make cocktails. So this is her attempt at a Malhorta muddle, which is pretty good.
What a marvelous educational opportunity.
I couldn't agree more.
The international school systems are to be admired for that.
They are indeed.
I'm simply drinking a beer. Sorry, it's a Hefeweizen this week, but in a nameless glass. I'm gonna have to get some more. Because I was very impressed with the glass that our guest has. But do you want to introduce our guest, Chris?
I'd be happy to.
Well, why don't you give it a shot?
Okay. This is a guy I met on the street. We were just kind of walking around London during our hour out, and I ran into him, and he said he'd love to talk. Our guest this week is Erik Flint, who is an old and dear friend. He is knew a lot of the Easy Company guys as I did, so we kind of got to know each other through that. He then helped out on a number of trips that we've done for Ambrose and I've done on my own. And then he became like my little prodigy, and I turned over Band of Brothers to him. So he's like my mini-me, only much thinner and in much better shape.
And that's why you made me take off the sport coat, isn't it?
Exactly right. But then in addition to that, in all seriousness, he is runs the Fort Lewis Army Museum and is an Army historian. So we're going to talk to Erik tonight about what exactly Army historians do, or combat historians, and how that's different than what the likes of you and I do. So.
It's a lot different. Is part
Slightly
of
more Kevlar.
And I would add to Erik's introduction that he, I think, 33 years in uniform, and in both the uniform of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps. So we will leave that be.
And, my standard joke is I was kicked out of college and joined the Marines because I thought college was hard.
Yeah. Okay. And so, and then you look at you. But Erik, let's see your mug there. You had a pretty special mug.
Well, since Chris is being all classy, I thought I'd go with something a little more sedate. So
nice.
All right.
Is that government issue?
This is, as a matter of fact, this is a government issue. You don't have one, Chris?
Well, I don't work for the government, so I don't get one.
Fair enough. Okay.
So, Erik, to start out, let's talk about how the Army has gathered and told the story of its own history. And I bet many people really aren't even aware that this goes on, that there are Army historians, there are combat historians, and you've been involved in both those roles. How did this get started, and why does the Army, specifically, and the military in general, why do they do this?
Well, I'll harken back to something Chris told me once a long time ago. History matters. You like that, Chris? That's a good callback. What's most interesting when I got involved in this was to find out that it really wasn't until the Second World War that the Army had a deliberate program to gather its own history, to capture it while it was happening, which was then followed by the creation of an official history. None of that existed. The closest the government came was during the Civil War. Following the Civil War, there was a creation of a massive, Chris, you'd have to, or Rick, maybe you guys know better about the series that was created after the Civil War. The official
128 volumes.
War of Rebellion.
Yeah, the official records of the War of Rebellion. Didn't they change it, though, to the War of Rebellion between the United States and the Confederate States or something like that?
Something, yeah.
Yeah. But those records were just official records, and they're a treasure trove for historians. All this raw data, all this wonderful information, but it's not like they were the federal government or the Army in this case took all of these records, put them into readable volumes that told a narrative story, and then of course were properly referenced for academics and other historians to go and research later. It was just essentially raw data. There was an effort during the First World War for the Army to create an official history. General Pershing wanted this done, and there was a lot of movement within the Army itself that this is important. We need to capture this. That was, however, squashed at the civilian level because the belief was that it would be impossible for an apolitical organization like the United States Army to write the history of a war without touching on elements of politics and society. And the belief that the U.S. military should be apolitical was so strong then within the government that the U.S. Army was essentially forbidden from writing its own history, which, again, I thought was absolutely fascinating. I mean, that's something that the U.S. military members have tried to varying success to remain apolitical and above the fray and just to concentrate on the mission, but understanding there's civilian control of the military. So what you had after World War I was all of these organizations creating these, after the war, these veterans organizations creating their own histories.
Well, so can I just interject? Yep, guys, you got to get a copy of this. It's kind of hard to see. American Armies and Battlefields in Europe. And Pershing put this together for what becomes the American Battle Monuments Commission, and it's not officially the official history, but it's kind of considered as such. And for those of you who don't know, our man Dwight David Eisenhower was Pershing's staff officer, and he actually assembled most of this. So
excellent.
Sorry.
So then, Erik, what happens in World War II? So what changes?
Well, what happens in World War II is the decision is made that this is so important very early on, is that there needs to be an Army Historical Department is created, an office. Oddly enough, it was attached to the G2, to intelligence. And they sent historians, many of them civilian academics, out into the field. And so there was this very deliberate effort, and the historical office got expanded, contracted, moved around under several different organizations. It was eventually taken out of G2 and made part of the general staff as part of the special staff section. So I wanted to talk about a couple of the really important personalities that drove this process and that influenced particularly how the United States Army gathers its own history today. And you can't talk about that in World War II without talking about SLA Marshall, someone Chris and I have talked about. There he is in the uniform of a brigadier general. He was, in fact, a brigadier general in the Michigan State Militia. He was a full colonel in the United States Army. He wears a combat infantryman's badge. He had a claim to be that he served in the First World War, and he claims to have been the youngest officer to have served in combat in the First World War. SLA Marshall is such a fascinating character because he himself says that he's not a historian, that he's a journalist.
Right.
In fact, his specialty was sports. And so the biggest influence SLA Marshall has on the Army and how it gathers its history is he's very early on. He's sent out to the Pacific, and he starts to he develops a process called the Group After Action Review or After Action Interview. And what this is he would take a squad, a platoon, a company that had just come out of combat, either a few hours before or a few days before, at the most a couple of weeks, and he would sit this group down and he would conduct essentially an after-action review, a post-combat interview, and say, "Tell me what happened." And what's interesting is he liked this group interview process as opposed to a one-on-one because he believed it would help balance out people's propensity to either overblow their participation or the opposite. And
like
so,
what Rick does with the Ghost Army.
What's that?
Like what Rick does with the Ghost Army.
Okay, bingo. So
Rick,
we all have to drink.
Ghost Army.
Ghost Army.
Sorry.
Thank you. For those not familiar with the Ghost Army drinking game, you'll figure it out. No, and so Marshall's idea is that so if he's got a group of people and Private Smith goes, "Well, yeah, then I kind of knocked out this machine gun. It was really no big deal," and the other guys will go, "No, that was amazing what you did. That was really cool." Or, "Well, I wiped out all the Japs single-handedly." No, you didn't. So his idea was that he would get a more honest assessment if he did these interviews in a group. And he became so effective at capturing what happened. Now, the thing was, Marshall is right up there at the front. And this is particularly in the Gilberts and the Marshall Islands campaigns. He's gathering this information so quickly. He essentially starts working with the local battlefield commanders, and particularly their S2, their intelligence, and their S3 operations folks, because he's the guy. He's out there essentially debriefing soldiers, going, "This is how the enemy's acting. This is who's out there. These are the tactics, the techniques, the procedures that are effective." Because Marshall will sit down, go through and interview a dozen rifle companies, and they'll say, "Oh, well, this is how we took out this type of position, or this is how we approached the Japanese who were doing X, Y, or Z." And so Marshall became an immediate asset. He wasn't out there just gathering raw data for later production in an official history. He was actively involved in operations. And what's so interesting, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the Army is trying to get its historians back into that staff role where they're essentially synthesizing, they're filling in a gap between operations and intelligence. Typically, your S2, your intelligence folks are going, "Hey, all right, this is what the enemy is going to do." And your operations folks go, "This is how we're going to defeat them." And the historian can bring in a lot of historical data and information to fill in those gaps. And we've already been seeing that done on kind of an unofficial capacity. But that's what Marshall was doing actively.
Because I noticed, getting to that point, Eric, a lot of what I was reading, the Army's publications kind of about the time of Iraq and earlier, was that the Army is just, the historian is just there to collect data.
Yeah.
Look it up.
Yeah.
So now they're kind of getting back to the idea of analyzing some of this, and
it's a constant battle for a military historian. I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but for instance, when I was in Iraq the first time, the guy who I replaced he wasn't able to get out in the field very much, because he said he showed up and the task force commander said, "Oh, you're my historian? All right, you need to write my history."
Right.
And it was a full colonel, and this guy was a captain, so he did what the colonel said. And so he sat in this big tactical operations center, just gathering what information he could and writing history, and he didn't get to get out operationally. When I came in, I was able to spend almost all my time out with the folks on the ground. So in that capacity, I was just out there. I was just gathering raw data. Mm-hmm. I might have some themes or some subjects that I was tasked with looking at, or I would develop on my own. But so getting back to your point is that's very true. The Army, during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, say during the surge, and then when we shifted all the efforts over to Afghanistan, at one point the Army had 2 military history detachments in the Central Command theater. They had one 3-person detachment in Iraq to cover Iraq, and one 3-person detachment in Afghanistan to cover all the operations in Afghanistan. And so there was no way that they were going to be able to, first of all, gather all the information that we really needed. But at the same time, they're so busy just trying to do that there was no way that they were going to be utilized operationally by the actual combatant commanders. Right. But it's a concerted effort on behalf of the Army Center of Military History, my senior headquarters, right now, is to operationalize historians and get them into those commands, and not just be there to gather the history, but we're here to put operations in a historical context. Just a quick side, I spoke with a colonel who had been an historian over in Iraq and Syria. And a senior general there said, a really smart guy called the historian in and said, "Hey, has Syria ever done X, Y, and Z before? Because they're threatening to do that." And this guy went off and did some research and came back and said, "Yeah, they've done it about 8 times in the last 30 years. And they always give the same reason." And so now the commanding general has this information, and he was able to go to the Syrians and say, "You guys have done this before."
Right.
And they went, "No, we haven't." He said, "Yeah, you did it this time, this time, this time, this time." And they kind of went, "Crap." And that's on a large strategic scale. But that's the kind of thing that maybe the intel people, because they're just trying to think like the enemy right now, and the operations people who are worried about operations right now and follow-on operations, that they're not trained to really reach back and be able to put things into a context.
Erik, you were in the Marines, as we discussed, and you were also in the infantry at some point in your career.
Yes.
And then you became a combat historian, a special command combat historian, and you did a couple of tours. So how did that happen? And this is you, I think, in your time.
What a baby!
Are those the Civil War pictures where they brought in the props?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
I mentioned to you, Chris. Just to my right there is the most comfortable mattress in Iraq. That's not saying a lot. But yeah, that was the night before I was sleeping on a cot in a medical supply closet out near somewhere. I moved every 1 to 3 days, so I really didn't know where I was half the time. Luckily, I wrote it down.
So how did you become a combat historian? And I want to ask you about that, and I'll ask you a second question at the same time. According to the Army's 2003 manual on military history operations, the chief of military history stated the most important qualification for a member of the MHD is not to be a historian, but rather a first-class soldier. So how did you become a historian, and why is it an important thing for the historian to be a first-class soldier? Which
and then how did you get the job, if that is the case?
I was never a first-class soldier. I'm proof positive if you hung around long enough and didn't do anything really stupid. Or
I don't believe any of that. But go ahead. How did you get into that?
By not managing my career very well. By kind of doing what I thought was interesting. No, I had an undergraduate degree in history. I had done some professional historical work as a civilian. And sort of in the middle of that process, I met Chris Anderson, and the rest there is history, and he got me involved in the historical tour business. What really happened, actually, I was at I had a undergraduate degree in history. I worked as a civilian. I had a master's degree in land warfare studies. And I had a job. I left the active duty Army. I was an enlisted Marine, went back to college, joined the Army National Guard, then joined ROTC when I was back in college, got a commission as an active duty infantry officer, did that for a little while, got out of active duty and went in the reserves. And being an officer in the reserves, you have an opportunity to do a lot of different things. It's not as much of a regimented career path as active duty. That's full-time service. So what I did, I was with a unit that was post 9/11. We were training people to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I was mobilized to Fort Lewis. I was on active duty. I ran a team of bad guys, an opposing forces team. And I did that for several years. And I was very fortunate that during that time, I got to do quite a bit of work with Special Forces, the Army Green Berets. That was really quite extraordinary work. But I gotten to the point where I had over 20 years service, and I was getting tired. And I had not deployed overseas, and I actually wanted to. I mean, as a soldier, whether you agree with the war or not, it's where you want to be. It's where history is happening. And I sat down, and there's a website that has tours for reserve soldiers. And I saw one for the Army Center of Lessons Learned. And I bring that up because that was an organization that was created back in the 1980s. We call it CALL, the Center for Army Lessons Learned. These are the folks who actually go out and do kind of what SLA Marshall did in World War II. They go out to the combat theater, conduct interviews, but they're not looking to gather historical data. They're looking to go, okay, what works? Their job is to go out into the field, find out what works and what doesn't, immediately get that back. And instead of going through the whole field manual creation, editing, publication process, they will do these quick turnaround pamphlets of going, this is how you conduct a key leader engagement in Afghanistan in whatever province. based on what we learned. And so you have Army Center of Lessons Learned, which does that. And I thought, hey, that would be great. That's kind of like being a historian. But I didn't have the education. I was a brand new major. I didn't have the level of Army education at that time. I had the civilian education. And I was really kind of upset, and they wouldn't take me. So I'm flipping through this list, and I see Special Operations Combat Historian. And that sounds interesting. And I contacted the Special Operations Command History and Research Office at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. They're in the Special Operations Command headquarters. And SOCOM, Special Operations Command, is the umbrella command that has all Army Special Forces, Green Berets, Rangers, Navy Special Warfare, Navy SEALs, Air Force Special Operations, and now the Marine Corps has their own MARSOC, Marine Special Operations. And all of that is under that one command. And the History and Research Office was this amazing office. I contacted them, said, I'd like to go do a tour. When they looked at my background and my education and my civilian historian experience, they said, yes, we want to deploy you, but we also want you assigned to the office. And so I was able to be assigned to the office as what they call an HDO, a historical documentation officer. And what that meant is I had the opportunity to deploy, in my case, to Iraq, get out there and just conduct hundreds of interviews, gather photographs, digital data, bring all that back to the office. And then when I'm back at the office, I was able to participate in the creation of history. And the SOCOM History and Research Office created both classified and unclassified studies for publication. A couple of things that I thought were really interesting about how the SOCOM History Office did business was they did, they did not, when we deployed out, they did not like group interviews. They would rather, the philosophy was get that one-on-one interview, go out, if you're going to go out with a Special Forces A team, 12 guys out in the middle of nowhere, don't sit down with all 12 guys and interview them about a particular operation. Interview all 12 guys separately about that operation. And then, you get everybody's perspective. And I was able to find that really effective. I was able to learn a lot about and get a more holistic view because I, interview 12 guys here about a particular operation, and maybe that operation touched on something somewhere else, and I'd go interview those guys from 12 different perspectives. The other thing was the way that the office produced histories. There was always the pressure, and I alluded to that earlier about, well, you're historians, write our history now. And the philosophy in the office was good history, and you both understand this. You need time and perspective. When I was there in, the late 2000s, 8, 9, 10, the newest study, the most recent study we were working on was Task Force Ranger in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1993. So that was the newest study that we were working on. They would do other more short-term things. Usually that's because someone says, I want to find out about this kind of operation going on in Iraq or Afghanistan. But I spent about 3 years with the office, which was really exciting.
So Erik, I want to kind of post some questions we're getting from folks because for some strange reason, people actually want to know what we have to say. So, we're going to try this here. Wait, sure. There we go. From Nancy.
Woo.
Nancy,
Chris. We have to toast Chris. Chris is taking control. He's pushing the buttons.
Chris. Here's to you. I'm proud of you.
Advancing into the 21st century. It's really exciting.
That is very impressive.
Erik, this is from Nancy. Yes. I have a particular interest in the journalists and correspondents who reported World War II, both leading up to and during the war. How do you regard their contribution? What have they contributed compared to historians like yourself? Wow.
Well, World War II is such an interesting case because, of course, the first person that comes to mind is Ernie Pyle.
Yep.
And his insight, having civilian correspondents, having civilian journalists on the battlefield, I think is absolutely critical. But that's critical for a different reason. We're there to gather. Again, my view as an Army historian is I'm there to gather raw data to be taken back, and then eventually the history is written there. Or to be, if you're a historian on a staff, you're there to help inform the commander giving historical perspective. Having civilian journalists, correspondents, they're there to tell the story of what's happening. Good, bad, or indifferent. In fact, that was one of the wonderful things, getting back to Eisenhower and the creation of the famous U.S. Army in World War II, the Green Books, is Eisenhower, unlike in World War I, he said, we need to write this, and even if it makes the Army look bad, we need to write the truth.
Right. Well, okay, finish.
Well, and I was just going to flash forward, and we're working on what they now call the TAN books, which is the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when the first volume was published a couple of years ago, it did not cast the Army in the best light. And it's an official Army publication. And when it was published, there were still senior officers who were either in uniform or only recently retired who did not like it because it, called them out by name. Right. But the Army Chief of Staff at the time, I believe it was General Ray Odierno, said, sorry guys, and it didn't make him look the best either. I mean, he made mistakes early on when he was a division commander in Iraq, but his thing was, this is the history. It's the truth. We can't learn from it if we don't tell the truth. So having civilian correspondents and journalists on the battlefield, and particularly in World War II, were there to tell the story to the American people.
Well, I'm gonna add to that in just a second, but I want to post another question, Rick, just to show you I can do it more than once.
I can't wait to see this.
Looks like I can take a week off next week. So.
This is from Tom, and it kind of goes along with what you were just saying. But he said, Tom wants to know, he says, I'm curious about how the official Army history treats controversial incidents such as the Myelin Massacre.
Thanks for the ringer question there, Thomas.
I do my best.
No, it's funny. For me, as a museum historian, I use the example of My Lai. For those who aren't familiar, an American rifle company was inserted into a Vietnamese village in March of 1968, and can only say murdered over 200 civilians, mostly women and children. It is easily one of the darkest chapters of Army history. It is not something we shy away from. And I use it as an example. For instance, I would not have an exhibit, a permanent exhibit, or maybe even a temporary exhibit at my museum on the My Lai Massacre. Mostly because we have, school groups, kindergartners coming through the museum, things like that. However, one of my main jobs at the museum is I'm there to train soldiers and utilizing history. And I have used My Lai. There was a battalion of Army criminal investigators who asked me to do a block of instruction for them on the My Lai Massacre and how Army criminal investigators investigated that massacre and what the Army did right and what the Army did wrong. And the investigators on the ground did everything right. But when it went up the chain of command, it was handled very poorly. And so and interestingly enough, I have a Huey helicopter sitting in the courtyard of my museum, but I mean, who doesn't? Everybody's got one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I just recently found out that my helicopter more than likely was one of the helicopters that inserted that rifle company into My Lai.
Wow.
It belonged to the 174th Attack Helicopter Company, which was the company that inserted the guys in there. So yeah, we don't highlight, if you go through my museum, you're going to get the Army story, but we will not shy away from if people ask us the hard questions.
Well, we have another viewer, Ross Wilson, who says it's a comment, not a question, saying it's unrealistic to think these histories are apolitical at some level. But it sounds to me like there's an effort to try to say we're going to make the histories realistic, let the chips fall where they may, because that's what's going to make us a better Army.
Absolutely, and that was Eisenhower's intent behind the Green Books.
Right.
It was not, here, let's write the
Can you
history.
explain what the Green Books are for people who don't know?
Certainly. The Green Books is the official U.S. Army history, the U.S. Army in World War II. And it's how many volumes, Chris? A lot.
Yeah,
Like
38 or 42, I want to say.
It's nuts. But it's an extraordinary effort. And the history can't be apolitical. That's why, for instance, with the TAN books about Iraq and Afghanistan, were not written by serving U.S. Army soldiers. That information may have been gathered by serving Army soldiers, but it's written by professional historians who are at the U.S. Army Center of Military History and the Histories Directorate, writing those based off of the data that they have. And now, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was going to say, Tom, I would just add to what Erik is saying is if you're familiar with these sorts of books, even it's very hard to not introduce bias into anything that's written. But if you read the green books, I'm sure the tan books will be the same. There's an incredible amount of detail about what happened, but there's almost no analysis. So that's left to the person that's reading the material to analyze it however they want to. So you can see in those books an attempt to stay as unbiased as possible.
I want to go ahead. Go ahead, Erik.
No, go ahead, Rick. I was just agreeing with Chris for some reason.
Just that
really? Really? Right?
Yeah, sorry, that was it.
Very
I'm out.
Moment. Going back to SLA Marshall, so a question came in from Catherine Beyer Hurst. She is my sister, and she's a very patient person, having to deal with me as a brother. But she wants to know, wasn't Marshall concerned about groupthink? So you talked about Marshall wanted to interview people as a group. Did he have any concerns, or would you have any concerns as a historian about the group then having kind of a group story that everybody wants to stick to instead of the individuals who give you the real story that maybe they would be embarrassed to say in front of the group? And this, I mean, it almost harkens back to kind of Law and Order episodes where they want to separate all the conspirators and put them in different rooms and ask them separately.
Absolutely. Now, whether Marshall thought about that, I think what Marshall was doing with the group combat after action interview was he created a method to gather information really efficiently. So instead of spending the time to sit down and interview 120 guys in a rifle company, if he can sit down with 80 of those guys in a group or, by platoon or what have you, and then get all that information, that history right away. Because if you read Marshall's stuff, first of all, Marshall has a real two-fisted style. It's like reading an adventure novel. But that's his journalistic background. He captures the events and the units and what happened. And absolutely. So flash forward to the way that I did it at Special Operations Command and how the office handled it. We did we didn't want group interviews for that very reason. We wanted everyone's individual perspective. I mean, raw historical data. And the Army, with its own military history detachments today, does the same thing. If at all possible, they want individual interviews.
Well, I would just throw in, though, too, Catherine, that I've actually been in situations where you have veterans from the same unit together. Erik has been there when we've had several members of each on a battlefield, and I found it very, very helpful to have multiple participants from an event there together because they police each other.
Yes.
They police each other, and it also helps when you're creating the story to come to a narrative that everybody can agree upon, which is helpful too. So,
which is hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. But
yeah, it's hard because there's so many different perspectives. And one of the things that I'm sure both of you have found and that I've found is, interviewing veterans of the Ghost Army.
Thank you. I was waiting for that.
I know you needed a refresher. Is that the problem of being a historian is that you have a very chaotic situation. You have people who have different accounts, And then, and maybe you can speak to this, Erik, and obviously, the reason you want to get the account right away is what I face interviewing veterans who are 50, 60, 70 years out, is that they've read all the other accounts.
Yes.
And so they start telling you stories that they read in your book or in somebody else's book. And or people will tell you about something that you can look in the records and know it's not true, know that it didn't happen that way. So there's a lot of, there's a need to gather the history right after it happens, but there's also kind of a lot of detective work that goes into analyzing the stories that are gathered and comparing them with the written record to try to figure out, maybe, as Chris said, a narrative that seems like it's maybe what makes sense of what really happened.
Absolutely. I had a really interesting experience. I think it was on my second trip to Iraq. One of the things I would do, and again, I'm usually there to go, okay, hey, what's going on now in your particular area of operations? But when I would sit down and interview an individual, in most cases, I spent most of my time with Army Green Berets. And if I were to sit down, I would typically go, okay, hey, give me your name. Tell me a little bit about your military background and how you got to be here. And over the course of a few months, I was talking to several guys from one particular special forces group. And they weren't all together. These were mostly senior guys, but it turns out they had all been on the initial invasion of Iraq about 5 or 6 years before. And they were all part of this initial aerial insertion into northern Iraq. They called it the Ugly Baby flight. That was the code name for this flight, not classified, by the way. There was one particular aircraft that just got completely shot up and had to do an emergency landing in Turkey. And it was this great big mess. And, this is an aircraft filled with explosives and, anti-tank rockets and all kinds of stuff. But what was interesting is here it is 5, 6 years after the fact. And I wound up just by happenstance coming across about 10 guys who were on that aircraft after the fact. And, after the first couple of guys I talked to, I said, I need to learn more about this. And so I was able to create, even though I'm not talking to them right after this happened, it was still fresh enough and that they had enough distance for their own perspective to talk about the operation, about what worked and what went right. So it was almost a sweet spot of, it didn't happen right after, but they had a little bit of perspective and a little bit of time to process it. And it was a pretty hairy event. But I was really able to kind of get a really good idea of what really happened. And again, I'm talking over a period of months to individuals, and I would see all these common threads, common timelines, common events, and then there'd be a few outliers. And Chris and Rick, I'm sure you both experienced that. So that was really fascinating.
Here's a question that Ted Moon has put to all of us, which is kind of pertinent to this. Have you, either Rick or Erik, have you come into situations where you've done an interview with multiple participants in an event, but then after that, one of the participants kind of pulls you aside and says, oh, by the way, Erik was full of it? But no, I certainly have.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and that's, and just for me, I can say, that's particularly true with, like, say, the E-Company vets.
Yeah.
Getting pulled aside. I didn't experience, because again, I didn't do that group interview when I did it, but it's something in talking to a group of particularly World War II veterans, you will get that off to the side. But that's the issue. Again, it's like if you could do a combination of both, you'd get the best of both worlds and hopefully filter out the worst of both techniques.
But sometimes that sidebar really is a series of emails for the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Right? In which you get, I've had this where someone was upset at something somebody else said, or sometimes upset at something I said. I'll give you one example. There was a veteran named Jack Macy of the Ghost Army who was interviewed. There you go. Cheers. Who was interviewed on NPR. It's a story that I didn't have anything to do with, but he was interviewed on NPR, and then NPR said in this course of the story that the Ghost Army was secret, and that soldiers had been told not to talk about it for 50 years after the war. And Jack took great offense at this because Jack had talked about it, and he felt like he was being called out for having spoken out of turn. And he sent me this is 10 or 15 years ago. He sent me a New York Times article from 1945 that says "Ghost Army, biggest secret of the war," or something like that. It wasn't secret. And we have found actually in that case that the Army was trying to keep it secret, but there was a few times when it kind of leaked out. But he kept sending me documents, newspaper clippings, comments that he found that other people had made. And I have had, and I'm sure you guys both have had this too. I have I don't know how many people, 12 people with whom I've had extended email conversations, which have yielded a lot of interesting information.
Well, I think, as we're talking about all these oral histories, and obviously that's something that Marshall kind of really got going. I think a lot of people that do particularly military history now, they rely too heavily sometimes on oral histories. And oral histories are still wonderful. They still can help illuminate certain things. But the real nuggets are, the real important stuff is still to go to the official records to actually do the heavy lifting of history.
Absolutely.
And then the oral histories can add to that, but it's still the hard work of just doing the
right.
And Chris, to solidify that point, again, to the Special Operations History and Research Office, that was how things were done. So if you were assigned, okay, time to write whatever, the first thing, and they had several PhD historians in the office, and the first thing they did is went to the official records.
Yep.
Whatever official, and then once you built that framework, then you would add the oral histories. I had one instance. It was one of those weird things where we were tasked to write a study for an operation that was actually still ongoing in Iraq, but it was one of the first times that the Iraqis were in the lead, and the only information I really had, apart from literally what I could pull down off the internet, I mean open source stuff, right, was some oral interviews. But that was an exception, not the norm. So go to the official records first.
Yeah. Then
fill it in.
Well, we can give a plug to Joe Balkowski, who was on the show earlier. I mean, that's one of the things that makes Joe's books so effective. I mean, Joe knew more members of the 29th Division probably than any historian alive, but he'll tell you the first thing you do is you go to the official history, then you go to the oral history. But another question, this one's from Jay, and kind of getting curious about your thoughts. Do you find soldiers are resistant to talk to you? How do you get them talking? And how do you kind of make it an effective interview?
That's an excellent question. And I was very lucky in that, especially speaking to special operations guys. And apart from Navy SEALs, who as soon as you get your Trident, you get a book deal and a movie contract.
What is that with the Marines?
I thought that was the historians.
Oh yeah,
we're the cool kids. Yeah,
that's right.
No, I mean, and so Army Special Forces guys really are quiet professionals. And these are the guys that don't like to talk a lot. So I had a standard spiel. I would show up and go, "Hey, my name's Erik." One of the great things was I was a major. I was usually the most senior guy wherever I was, especially once I got out with the teams. But Velcro is a wonderful thing, and I always took my rank off and just had like U.S. Army. I didn't have my name, but they all knew who I was, and I would say, I'm not public affairs, I'm not lessons learned, I am not from the command. I said, this is for the historical record only. Your boss isn't going to hear this. Your boss's boss isn't going to hear this. It's going from me back to a secured archive at the command headquarters for use 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. So that was to establish. The other thing is my own personal bona fides was I spoke the language. Yeah. And special operations, like every subculture in the military, has its own language. And I was able to adopt that language and adopt that appearance. And I knew how to wear my equipment and what cool guy terms to use. And I mean, it was
Yeah, look at there. See.
Yeah. It was, so being able to speak the language of the locals was very important. And I mean, I honestly, in almost 400 interviews that I conducted in overseas, I had one interview where I had a guy who, the shortest interview I had, and it was 15 minutes. And that was him giving me one word answers. Yeah. No. Okay. The typical guy was some super tough Green Beret going, yeah, I don't know if I really have anything to say. I don't want to talk, yeah, whatever. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, sir. And then, an hour and a half later, I know who his kids are. But I would get what was going on then. But a lot of these guys, since a lot of these Army Special Forces guys are senior, and at this time, they'd all had multiple deployments. And so I'm getting a lot of backstory information. So it was, I wore the same uniform. I understood their language. So when I went in, I used their terminology. And that was an advantage that a lot of historians didn't get, because I'd also had the opportunity to train with Special Forces a lot before. Right. And so I learned, again, how they functioned, how they acted, how they spoke. And to show that you really cared, and especially with these guys, knowing that, hey, nobody's going to hear this right away. Yeah. So be open. And they certainly were. That was, if they were going to criticize somebody, it was pretty open. So
one of the other questions, it's the softball that Rick usually throws, but I'm going to get to it now.
I prefer the phrase open-ended question.
As a historian, how important do you think it is, and how important to the work that you do is it to actually be on the spot or in the environment where these things are happening?
In some ways, it's very important. But like anything, there's no one best method, because there's an element of being detached, which gives you that perspective and that distance. Being on the ground. So with say, for instance, with each oral interview that I would conduct, as much as possible, I would do a written write-up along with it. And then at the end of every now and then, I would do kind of a write-up of, if I'd been operating in a particular area, I would do a write-up. And so I would be able to kind of add my own, that's where I get to put in my take on the environment, on the themes that I saw. If you got 10 out of 12 guys complain about the same Iraqi or the same issue with the higher command, or would highlight, hey, this was really working great, I could bring that forward. So being able to be on the ground at the time as a historian, capturing it, it's just a piece, and it's great stuff, and but it's raw data, and it hasn't been really put in any perspective. So,
okay, Rick, there you go.
Well, I think it's nicely done, Chris. Nicely done. We are coming near the end of our interview, because we have a couple of features that we're doing after the interview with you, Erik. I mean, of course, they will pale in comparison to our time with you. Who knows why we even bother? I thought it was interesting to note also, I mean, you have combat historians out gathering material. You have the records that are preserved. In some cases, the historians also involved in the preservation of the records and combat journals and such. And also that since 1968, the Army has been conducting veteran surveys, where they have, which they started to do in order to capture the stories of people the few remaining veterans from the Spanish-American War, but that they've continued that now, and they do. They've got about 35,000 surveys at AHEC, at the Army Historical
Education Command,
Education Center. And some of them are, yes, no answers, and some of them are almost like unpublished manuscripts that people submitted when they got the survey. So I think it's interesting that, again, the institutional oomph that the U.S. Army puts behind gathering history. They're writing some of it too, but they're trying to gather it and make sure it's there and not going away.
Yes. Preservation.
So, Rick, along what Rick said, a lot of that stuff is public domain, Erik. So if some of our listeners wanted to find some interviews of veterans of Vietnam, where would they go? How do they get the Army's, or an easy way? I mean, not, is there an institution? Is there an archive? Is there?
Unfortunately, that stuff is kind of scattered all over.
Yeah.
And despite its best efforts, the Army is really trying to centralize things. Like AHEC in Carlisle, Pennsylvania has a lot of individual stuff. The National Archives at College Park, Maryland have a lot of the unit histories. The Army museums, there's no deliberate process for us to gather records, but people give us a lot of stuff. And so we have this amazing paper archives that's purely donated, and Army museums are across that. The best thing to do is to go to the National Archives or AHEC, AHEC, Army History and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, or go to armyhistory.com or armyhistory.gov, which is the U.S. Army Center of Military History. That's the best place to start.
Yep.
And AHEC, you can search a lot of stuff online. That you can also call them. Their librarians are super helpful in helping you find something. And if there's something you want, you can go there to take a look at it and go through stuff. And again, they're super helpful. Been there multiple times, as I'm sure both you guys have as well. So pretty great place.
Yeah, they're wonderful. The passion that particularly the folks at AHEC have for preserving that information and making it available is really extraordinary.
So Erik, we have to kick you off now so that Chris can tell a joke. I mean, that's the main important thing that's going on. You better have one ready, Chris. So, but we want to thank you for joining us today. And if you want to hang out, we're dropping you out of the stream. But if you want to hang on a minute, we can chat later, and you can criticize us for anything we failed to ask you about.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
But thank you so much, Erik Flint, who is, as we mentioned, a former combat historian and currently the director of the Lewis Army Museum, someplace in Washington State. I don't even know.
Joint Base Lewis McChord, Washington, just south of Tacoma.
Say that.
There you go. Boom. Boom. Thank you, Erik.
Erik.
So, Chris, we have two things left to do, and the first is it's your turn to do a little history all around us.
Okay.
And you have you turned up, I thought, some interesting items relating to history from kind of both your hometowns of Boston and London, although it actually has to do with neither of those hometowns. So tell us about that.
Well, as you may have read in the news, we get to go out for an hour or so to get some exercise, and so I've been trying to see as much as I can within an hour's walk of my place here in London. And during a walk the other weekend, we came across a plaque marking the spot. There you go. Ho Chi Minh worked at the Carlton Hotel, which is no longer there, but that's where the Carlton stood. Very sadly, right next to the plaque, I don't know if Rick has the picture or not, but there was, that's all the beer that is now at the pub that was going to be served where the Carlton Hotel was, that now is going to be poured out. So that was a very sad picture.
They're going to pour out beer?
Yeah.
The crisis has reached new tragic proportions.
It has. But the plaque there is of Ho Chi Minh, and it caused me to think that Ho Chi Minh, aside from founding modern Vietnam, actually had a long career in food service. And it reminded me that he had also worked in the kitchen at the Omni Parker House. There's a picture of Ho during his time at the Parker House in Boston. So, if you're trying to decide where you want to take your career, start off in food service and then start a country, I guess.
You know, it's interesting because, in a serious note, I mean, he was a man of the world. I mean, he'd lived in Boston, he'd lived in London, he was in Paris at the Versailles Conference.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's like the Where's Waldo of 20th century history.
And I was reading, I finally finished Andrew Roberts' Churchill biography, but, you know, Churchill was another guy who, of the leaders in World War II, he was really the only one who was conversant with the whole world. He'd been to India, he'd been to the United States, he'd been to Italy and Germany and all these places in which Mussolini couldn't say that, Hitler couldn't say that, and Roosevelt's travel was limited. So it's offers an interesting perspective. And it's also worth pointing out that at the Omni Parker House in Boston, where Ho Chi Minh worked, that Malcolm X also worked. Now, I don't believe they were there at the same time. I think it's about 20 years difference, but honestly, great one-act play to write to put them both in the kitchen at the same time. And finally, we did promise people this week we would do, and I know that we have 50 viewers who have waited for this so far, that we would do a history joke of the week.
There we go.
And with an expectation on my part that this is going to be a real eye roller. Okay, that I'm not expecting. I'm going to sit back, Chris, give you the screen, and say, tell us a good history joke.
All right. So a Frenchman walks into a library and he's very animated and very excited. And he goes up to the front desk. The librarian's there and he kind of gets the librarian's attention, and the librarian looks up and kind of startled eye. And the Frenchman says, excuse me. But do you have Andrew Roberts' book on the history of the Second World War? And the librarian says, well, of course we do. It's a very highly regarded book. It's in demand, but we have it right now. And the Frenchman says, oh, thank God. I've been wanting to read it. Can I check out the book? And the librarian says, no, I'm sorry, you can't. And the Frenchman says, but why? It's available, and I have a library card. And the librarian looks at him and says, well, if I give it to you, you're just going to lose it anyway.
Oh, the Second World War. Okay.
You said it had to be bad. That was pretty bad.
It was. Can we get some comments on that joke? Because I think that is a pretty bad joke. I mean, how many stars are we going to give Chris for that joke? I want to see some response. I can even see Erik groaning, and he's not even with us anymore.
Trust me, the jokes will get worse.
We promise. We do promise that the jokes will. Here, I would also one of my favorites, very old joke, which you probably know. But did you know that Custer was very well dressed at the Battle of the Little Bighorn?
I didn't.
Yes, turns out he was wearing an Arrow shirt.
Oh.
Okay. And now, Erik, stop laughing there. You're not with us anymore. Stop laughing. Okay. It was a Frenchman, Kathy, not a freshman. We try to get to as many questions as we could. We appreciate everybody being here. And we appreciate Erik Flint joining us. Thank you so much for being everybody part of History Happy Hour today. And I just want to mention that on our website, on the Ambrose website, you can find our reading list. And I'm going to try to post it up here as well. We have a reading list of stuff related to each of our broadcasts. And so you can check out the reading list. And I also, did I post it? Yes. Okay. And I also wanted to post, just because I thought it was interesting, that we found online an Army Field History Manual. So if you want to read the instructions that the Army is giving and the doctrine that they're giving to the field historians, you can find that as well. So thank you, everybody, so much. And of course, though, Chris, we can't end the show without doing what?
The video.